August 3rd, 1492. The port of Palos de la Frontera, Spain. 3 ships are preparing to depart on a voyage that will change the world forever. Standing on the deck of the Santa Maria is a man the world knows as Cristoforo Columbus, Admiral of the ocean sea, the explorer who will sail west to reach the east, and instead stumble upon 2 continents that Europe never knew existed. Every schoolchild learns his name. Every history textbook repeats his story. Born in Genoa, Italy. Son of a wool weaver, a visionary navigator who convinced the Spanish monarchs to fund his impossible dream. But what if almost everything we've been taught about this man is a lie? What if the city of his birth is wrong? What if his father's profession is fiction? What if even his name, Cristoforo Columbus, Cristoforo Colombo, Cristóbal Colón, is not his real name at all, but a carefully constructed disguise meant to hide a dangerous secret? For over 500 years, historians have debated the true origins of Cristoforo Columbus. Dozens of cities across Europe have claimed him as their native son. Countless theories have emerged about who he really was and why his early life remains so mysteriously obscure. But now, in October 2024, modern science has finally solved the mystery. A team of Spanish scientists led by forensic geneticist José Antonio Lorente has analyzed DNA extracted from Columbus's remains. And the results don't just challenge what we learned in school. They completely overturn it. The man who discovered the New World was not who we thought he was. And the truth has been hidden in his bones all along. Open any American history textbook published in the last century, and you'll read the same story. Cristoforo Columbus was born in 1451 in Genoa, a bustling port city in what is now Italy. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a humble wool weaver. Young Cristoforo went to sea as a teenager, learned navigation, and eventually became obsessed with the idea of reaching Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. He spent years trying to convince European monarchs to fund his expedition, and finally King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain agreed. In 1492, he sailed west, reached the Caribbean islands, and the age of European exploration of the Americas began. That's the story. That's what we were taught. But here's the problem. Almost none of it can be verified. There are no birth records for Cristoforo Columbus in Genoa, no baptismal certificate, no childhood documents. His supposed father's occupation changes depending on which historical source you read. Sometimes he's a wool weaver, sometimes a tavern keeper, sometimes a cheese seller. The earliest documents we have of Columbus himself don't appear until he's already an adult living in Portugal. It's as if the first 30 years of his life have been erased. Even stranger, Columbus himself seems to have deliberately obscured his origins. He rarely spoke about his childhood. He never returned to Genoa, despite becoming one of the wealthiest and most famous men in Europe. He wrote thousands of letters and kept detailed journals, yet he almost never mentions his family or his early years. When he does reference his background, the details are vague, contradictory, or suspiciously incomplete. Historians have noticed something else peculiar. Columbus's handwriting, his linguistic patterns, and his spelling don't match someone who grew up speaking the Genoese dialect of Italian. Instead, his Spanish contains influences that suggest he may have grown up speaking Catalan, Castilian, or possibly Portuguese. Some scholars have even argued that he never wrote in Italian at all, which would be extraordinarily strange for someone supposedly born in Genoa. Over the centuries, more than a dozen cities have claimed to be Columbus's true birthplace. Theories have placed his origins in Portugal, Catalonia, Galicia, Majorca, Greece, and even Poland. But the most persistent and compelling alternative theory is this: Cristoforo Columbus was not Italian. He was Spanish, and more specifically, he was Jewish, a converso, a Jew who had been forced to convert to Christianity during the Spanish Inquisition, but who secretly maintained his Jewish identity in hiding. If true, this would explain everything: the hidden origins, the fabricated backstory, the refusal to return home. Because in 1492, Spain, being openly Jewish, could get you expelled, imprisoned, or killed. For 500 years, this mystery seemed unsolvable. Columbus's early life was simply too well hidden, too carefully erased. But then, in 2003, Spanish historian Marcial Castro and forensic geneticist Dr. José Antonio Lorente from the University of Granada launched an extraordinary project. They would use DNA to settle the question once and for all. The problem was finding Columbus's DNA. Christopher Columbus died in 1506 in Valladolid, Spain, and his remains have had a strange journey. He was initially buried in Valladolid, then moved to Seville, then transported across the Atlantic to Santo Domingo in the Caribbean, then allegedly moved to Havana, Cuba, and then back to Seville after Cuba gained independence. Both Seville, Spain, and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic claim to hold Columbus's authentic remains. For over a century, no one knew for certain where the real Christopher Columbus was buried. In 2003, Dr. Lorente's team exhumed remains from the Seville Cathedral that were believed to belong to Columbus. They found fragments of bone, small pieces that had survived centuries of movement and reburial. From these fragments, they carefully extracted DNA. But DNA alone isn't enough. You need something to compare it to. So the team also exhumed remains of Columbus's younger brother Diego and his son Hernando, and both of whom were buried in Seville with clear documentation of their identities. If the bones in Seville truly belonged to Christopher Columbus, the DNA should show a familial relationship. The initial results, published in stages over the years, confirmed that the Seville remains were indeed Christopher Columbus. The DNA matched his brother and his son. But the team didn't stop there. Dr. Lorente wanted to know not just if these were Columbus's bones, but who Columbus actually was. Where did his ancestors come from? What was his genetic heritage? To answer these questions, they needed to analyze the DNA at a much deeper level. Looking at Y chromosome markers that reveal paternal ancestry and comparing them to genetic databases of European populations. This process took over 20 years. DNA analysis technology improved. Databases expanded. And finally, in October 2024, Dr. Lorente's team announced their findings at a press conference that sent shockwaves through the historical community. The DNA results showed that Christopher Columbus was not from Genoa, Italy. The genetic markers did not match northern Italian populations. Instead, the DNA was consistent with populations from the Western Mediterranean, specifically the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal. Even more remarkably, the DNA showed markers consistent with Sephardic Jewish ancestry, the Jewish communities of Spain and Portugal. Christopher Columbus, the man who sailed under the Spanish flag and changed the world, was almost certainly Spanish and quite possibly of Jewish heritage. The DNA evidence is powerful, but it doesn't stand alone. Once scientists revealed the genetic findings, historians began re-examining Columbus's life with fresh eyes, and suddenly, details that had seemed insignificant became profoundly important. Let's start with the timing. Christopher Columbus set sail on August 3, 1492. That date is famous. But here's what most people don't know. August 2, 1492, just one day earlier, was the final deadline for all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country forever. The Alhambra decree, issued by Ferdinand and Isabella, expelled an estimated 200,000 Jews from Spain in one of the largest forced migrations in European history. The ports were flooded with Jewish refugees desperately trying to flee, and in the middle of this chaos, Columbus quietly departed. Historians have long noted this timing, but dismissed it as coincidence. Now, with the DNA evidence, it looks far more significant. Was Columbus fleeing? Was his voyage not just about exploration, but about escape? Then there are Columbus's personal writings. Throughout his letters and journals, Columbus uses peculiar phrases and symbols that have puzzled scholars for centuries. He frequently writes con Dios, with God, but not in the standard Catholic formula. He uses Hebrew-style dating in some of his letters, referencing Jewish calendar systems. He writes the letters Bet Hey at the top of some documents, which is a traditional Jewish abbreviation for Baruch Hashem, blessed be the name, a phrase observant Jews still use today. Even his famous voyage had strange connections to Jewish history. Columbus's expedition was partially funded by Luis de Santangel and Gabriel Sanchez, both conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity who held powerful positions in the Spanish court. Some of Columbus's key crew members were also conversos. When Columbus reached the Americas, one of his interpreters was Luis de Torres, a converso who spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, languages useful for communicating with Asian peoples but utterly useless in the Caribbean. Why bring a Hebrew speaker unless you expected to need one? Or unless you wanted someone you could trust? The DNA findings also explain Columbus's obsession with secrecy. In 1492, Spain, the Inquisition was actively hunting conversos who were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. If you were caught lighting Shabbat candles, refusing to eat pork, or observing Jewish holidays, you could be arrested, tortured, and executed. If Columbus were a converso from a Spanish Jewish family, he would have every reason to invent a false backstory, to claim he was a foreigner from Genoa rather than a Spaniard with dangerous ancestry. The fabricated Italian origin wasn't just a lie, it was survival. Modern science has given us the genetic truth, but it can't tell us what it felt like to live that lie every single day. Imagine being Cristoforo Columbus. You grow up in Spain, possibly in a Jewish family that has already been forced to convert to Christianity. You've seen neighbors arrested by the Inquisition. You've watched families torn apart. You know that your bloodline, your heritage, is now a crime. So you make a choice. You invent a new identity. You claim you're from Genoa, a city far enough away that no one in Spain can easily verify your story. You learn to speak and write like a foreigner. You never mention your real family. You burn the bridges to your past, and then, against all odds, you become famous. You become the Admiral of the ocean sea. You discover lands that will make you immortal, but you can never tell the truth. You can never go home because home doesn't exist anymore. The Jewish Spain you knew has been destroyed by the Inquisition. Your people have been scattered across the Mediterranean, and if anyone discovers who you really are, everything you've built, your titles, your wealth, your legacy, could be taken away in an instant. So you stay silent. You take your secret to the grave. You leave instructions that your bones be moved, again and again, as if even in death you can't rest, can't be found, can't let anyone get too close to the truth. This is not the triumphant story we learned in school. And this is a story of survival, of a man forced to erase himself to escape persecution. And it reframes everything about Columbus's legacy. He wasn't just an explorer, he was a refugee. He wasn't just ambitious, he was desperate. And the voyage that changed the world forever may have been, at least in part, an escape from a world that wanted to destroy him. The revelation that Cristoforo Columbus was likely Spanish and possibly of Jewish ancestry doesn't just change one man's biography. It challenges how we understand the entire age of exploration. How many other historical figures have hidden origins? How many of the explorers, merchants, and scientists who shaped the early modern world were conversos fleeing persecution, using their forced mobility to achieve things that would have been impossible if they had stayed home? As the DNA, evidence forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how history is written. For centuries, the story of Columbus has been claimed by Italian nationalism, celebrated as proof of Italian genius and daring. Statues of Columbus stand in Italian-American communities across the United States. Cities celebrate Columbus Day as a celebration of Italian heritage. But if Columbus was not Italian, if he deliberately falsified his origins, then whose story is this really? And what does it mean that we're only discovering this now, in 2024, more than 500 years after his death? It means that the history we teach is often based on incomplete evidence, on stories that serve political or cultural purposes rather than truth. It means that every generation must be willing to question what previous generations accepted as fact. And it means that science, particularly DNA analysis, is giving us the power to rewrite history in ways that would have been impossible just decades ago. The bones don't lie. The genetic code doesn't care about national pride or cultural mythology. It simply reveals what is. Cristoforo Columbus remains one of the most controversial figures in history. His voyages opened the door to European colonization of the Americas, a process that brought catastrophic destruction to indigenous peoples. That legacy cannot be erased or ignored. But now we know something else about Columbus. We know that he himself was fleeing destruction, that he came from a persecuted people, that his identity was a carefully constructed fiction designed to save his life. The truth is complicated. The truth is uncomfortable. And the truth has been hidden in his DNA all along. So here's my question for you. Does knowing Columbus's true identity change how you see his legacy? Should history textbooks be rewritten? And what other historical figures do you think might have hidden origins waiting to be revealed by modern science? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this discovery shocked you, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel because we're uncovering truths that have been buried for centuries. Thank you for watching. And remember, the stories we're taught are not always the stories that are true.